Let's go. That subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. It even has a watermark. What's up, y'all? Let's go. What's going on? How's everybody tonight? Tonight we're doing Bret Easton Ellis's 1991 novel, American Psycho. This is going to be a good one. I hope this is going to be a good one. This is, we got a lot to cover tonight, so hope everybody's doing well. Thank you for being here, and if you want to support me, please make sure that you smash that like, leave a comment after the stream. I really appreciate that, you guys. And also, you can click that little $dollar sign down there in the bottom and send me a super chat, or you can send me a PayPal Cash App. My Cash Appski is working perfectly now, or Venmo. I really appreciate the support. So let's dive into it. So tonight, we're covering American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. And we're going to be doing a literary analysis, the analysis of the book, of course, because this is based literary analysis. And, of course, tied into that, we'll be talking plenty about the 2000 Mary Harron film, which is really, I mean, I'm going to try not to fan too much over this film because it's, one of my favorite movies. I mean, if you haven't seen it, that's okay. But probably a lot of us have seen the movie, 322,000 times. So tonight we're getting into the book, though. So we're going to discuss the book. I've got a lot to talk about with this, and we'll be diving into form, content, and meaning. And my central thesis, really, in the book is... Well, let me put it to you first as a question. The question, I think, is one that comes naturally out of both the book and the film, and that is that the reader or the viewer, especially the reader with the book, you have a sort of a decision to make, and it's purposefully ambiguous. Obviously, it's whether the things that are described in the book, especially the violence, the ultra violence. Whether all of that is real or not, and whether it is a pure satire, right, or whether it's the story of a genuine serial killer. And my thesis is that both are true, and I'll discuss what that means as we get into the book. And I think that there are a number of ways that we can describe the book, and we're going to get into all that. And I would say that we could say that it is a postmodern satire. It's a cultural commentary. It's a dark comedy. It's a black comedy. It's a critique of capitalism. It's the story of a psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? It's pop culture excess. It's all these. It is all of those things. And one thing that strikes me about the novel is, first of all, that it's not Bret Easton Ellis' first novel, and he was 27 when he published the novel. It was published in March 1991. Bret Easton Ellis was born in 1964, and it's really amazing. This guy can write, okay? Bret Easton Ellis can write, and we've done Lunar Park. Remember, we did Lunar Park, which is tied in with Bateman. That's one of the central driving forces in the narrative. Of course, we did a long stream on that one. I haven't done Less Than Zero. I don't plan on doing Less Than Zero. Less Than Zero was Bret Easton Ellis' first novel, and he published it, as I discussed in that one. He published that one while he was still a student. He was a college student. And let's see, Rules of Attraction. I've read Rules of Attraction, which is really about Bateman's brother, and Sean Bateman, and he turns up in American Psycho. He's not in the film, but he's plays a small role in the book. I mean, there's a lot in the book that the film doesn't go into, and the film is its own animal. Just like we discussed in that last stream with Clockwork Orange, the two things, Kubrick makes the film his own work, and the same thing happens with Mary Harron in American Psycho. I was just watching a Charlie Rose interview with Christian Bale, Bret Easton Ellis, and Mary Harron from 2000, right before the film came out. And Christian Bale was let's see, he was 20. I think he was 26 when the movie came out. So he's about Bateman's age, and one of the things that they talked about was that Bret Easton Ellis, and this wasn't just for the interview that he said this, because oftentimes, as Anthony Burgess said in the introduction to A Clockwork Orange, oftentimes the authors will have a major problem with the way that their film is adapted, and I discussed, what that means in terms of selling the rights to the film and all that. But in this one, Bret Easton Ellis discusses how one thing that he likes the film, and that one thing that it did was it brought out the humor of the book. It sort of distilled the humor, and it is. I mean, it is funny. It's obviously a complex, adult kind of humor, but it is funny. It's funny. It's a funny movie, and the book though is completely different. And that's due to a number of things. I mean, the disjointed sort of I don't know what you would call it, the disjointed heterogeneity of the landscape of sort of postmodernism within the book it leads the reader to a different place than the film does. And, I'm not trying to sound, I don't know, that sounded like sort of a complex term. And I guess I'll discuss what that means as we keep going. But I think that the book is so different, and there's so many different themes that we can discuss in it. So I guess we'll dive into it. What the book is about is essentially the book has no plot, right? It has no real purpose, and he blatantly says that. The speaker, Patrick Bateman, Pat Bateman, says that a number of times. I mean, in fact, he says it at the end, right? This confession has meant nothing, but the nothingness plays an active role in the book, in the narrative, and in the entire critique of 80s excess culture leading into the early 1990s. The book takes place really between like 1997 and 1990. And then, of course, the book itself was published in 91. 91, one of the best years of all time, by the way. 1991 is like one of the turning points in culture. I mean, I was 10 and then 11 years old in 1991. And it's amazing the shift in culture that took place, especially in terms of music and film. And what a great year. And I think that, looking back, I mean, I've mentioned this a number of times, but it's like the 90s at the time, I remember I was aware enough, even as a, preteen, to know that like the cultural response especially in the early 1990s was that there was just nothing. There was nothing happening. There was nothing that like set it apart from the other generations, and that was probably mostly intelligentsia and boomers comparing the decade to their own, etc. Especially coming off the wave of the 1980s. But then looking back, post Big Nine era, we see that no, there was a lot going on in the 1990s. I mean, I'm not speaking geopolitically or anything. I'm just talking about in terms of common culture. And one thing's for sure is that you look back and people, I'm probably looking back at this with a sense of, cheap nostalgia, but it's like people had a light in their eyes, right? There was a, and not in the 1960s way of like riding the high, the crest of a high and beautiful wave. It was more just a sense of, I don't know, peace and pre-Big Nine hopefulness or something. I don't know. But the I can't think of a better novel that I've read that really captures the essence of what we think of the 80s than this one. And again, it's incredible because he's 27 years old when he published this book. I mean, it really is a tour de force. It's this phenom of writing. He's such a good writer. He's like, to me, he is like the writer's writer. In the sense that there are a lot of comparisons that you can make between this and Blood Meridian, by the way, which we've covered. Especially in specific passages where Bateman really gives an insight into the darkness in his soul and in his vision, complete with like sort of the imaginary volcanic landscape and what he says in one part, which is the total destruction of the world. I mean, Bateman lives in this world of, corporate raiders, high finance, and the high Manhattan lifestyle, which is interesting because none of that is really discussed. In fact, he never really did. He works at P&P, right? He works at Pierce & Pierce doing mergers and acquisitions or murders and executions. And he never really discusses what he does for a living. In fact, in the book and in the film, we never see him doing anything. And that's kind of the point, right? That he never really has to do anything. We know that we know where he went to school. We know about his family. We know about all of his friends. And we know, my sister says, she super chats, and she says, look at that subtle off-white coloring, the tasteful thickness of it. Oh my God. It even has a watermark, which is one of the points where he has a full-on anxiety attack. And actually, a little bit of, I brought a prop to the stream tonight, you guys, because I actually have, is that a gram? New card. It's Cillian Braille. And then David Van Patten says, that's nothing. That's good, Bateman. But look at this, right? That's, what is it? Eggshell with Romalian type. And I've got David Van Patten's card here. I know it's mirrored, but that's the Pierce & Pierce card. I had a girlfriend who like in 2001, we watched a movie together, and we watched that scene, and then she bought me a whole set of Van Patten's cards, so complete with the font. Anyway, so yeah, one of the major issues I think in the book is the issue of identity or misidentity or dissociation, and that is like one of the obvious. I don't know if it's obvious. I mean, it's obvious to me. I think it's obvious to anyone watching it. Of course, it's not obvious. For instance, if you watch the film for the first, I first saw this in 2000. I rented the videotape. I have to return some videotapes. I rented the videotape when I was at university in Northern Ireland, and I rented it like on a Sunday and watched the film. And my first, impression of it was that like. I got the black comedy of it, but that it was that the serial killer aspect of it was literal, right? That he was literally doing these things, and then as you go on and you watch the film a number of times, like with your friends or whatever, you start to think, no, this is illusory. This is all imaginary, like not his daily life. It's not a dream. It's not cheap like that. But that it is. But that all of this is just a fantasy, right? Meat, bone, right? In his New York Times crossword page, the drawings, the unrecognition, and then I think, at least I personally, came to a point where I think that both are true. So yeah, okay. So let me get back to it. So the novel is about a guy named Patrick Bateman. Hi, Pat Bateman. Who is a 27-year-old living in Manhattan in the American Gardens building off of Central Park. He works at Pierce & Pierce, P&P, doing mergers and acquisitions. He's got three friends, Bryce, or as he is in the book, Price, Van Patten, and Craig McDermott. And then he also works, there's another guy named Lewis, who is a tumbling, pumpkin. He who is a sort of a sideline, and then he dates a number of women, and of course he has a fiance at the same time who's in the film played by Reese Witherspoon, and he goes out with a girl named Courtney who is they're all the like friends and their girlfriends are like dating each other, right? Which is not, I guess, unusual in 1980s in this world, right? And he basically spends his days at work. He has a strict workout regimen and a routine in the morning. And then he goes to work basically doing nothing. He has a a passion for music in the sense that everything that he does, I mean, it's called American Psycho. And I think that one of the things is that it goes from being psychopathic to purely psychotic. He has a psychotic break. And all of his emotions and, inner feelings and the way that he expresses himself are purely, as the speaker says, as Bateman says, surface. Everything is surface. He has no identifiable traits, right, except for greed and disgust. And this bleeds into, I guess pun intended, into his daily life, when he's always seeking like a greater. He's really, it's as Norm Macdonald said, he's just trying to feel something, because he seeks a greater, more freedom, I suppose, in the sense that he can do anything and get away with it. And so the violence in the book is interesting because it doesn't take place for like 100 pages. We just see him living his life and going through all of the fashion, the style, all of the hallmarks of like 1980s excess, sex, drugs, going to rock concerts, which Bateman hates, by the way. There's a really funny part in the book where he's sort of forced to go to a U2 concert, and he's never heard of U2. Because it's the 80s, and it's like the mid to late 80s, and so they're just sort of hitting it big. But he hates going to rock concerts, and then he like makes eye contact with Bono, who like he has this moment with, and he has that a number of times. He has it with an animal at one part, with an owl, later on in the film, and then he kills a homeless guy. First, he starts off killing animals, and then he kills a homeless guy, and then he sort of works up into, killing prostitutes, etc. But again, the question is whether this is real, because everyone calls each other by the wrong name, except for the people that he knows the best. I mean, especially Price, who is the only interesting guy that he knows. And another aspect is that all of the side characters who sort of play they don't float in and out of his life. I mean, they're constants, but they essentially, all they do is, spread gossip, as he says, onto Kimball, the detective. And Price plays a pretty big role in the first part of the book because he's so interesting. He's like genuinely interesting, and he's funny. He's really funny. But then he sort of disappears. And one thing that I think is interesting is that when Price comes back in the book, Bateman keeps mentioning how he has a smudge. He has a smudge on his forehead, and I read that to mean that Price has been to an Ash Wednesday service. That's the only way I could read it. And he sort of finds redemption. He stops drinking. He stops. I think he gets off drugs, but we don't see that. We don't really see that. We only like sort of hear it mentioned, and he kind of disappears from the novel. So what I want to do is talk about the language of the book and how Bret Easton Ellis is really masterful at bringing us into this world, and like how he, his construction in the book, and how he creates this world that like we think we know, and that even after we know it, we still don't know it, because just like the characters in the book, they don't really know each other. And all of the time they have these misrepresented cues, and they can never understand each other. And I read one review that said that the characters are all going through the same thing, and they just are unable to communicate with each other. I think that's not true. I think that Bateman's situation is probably unique. They're all in the same sort of position. They're all VPs at P&P, but nobody else really shares the kind of feelings that he does, if he has feelings, because everything that he has is an imitation of a human being, in a sense. He even talks about how, he is really Satan in a number of ways, or at least he's a satanic figure in this, because everything that he does is filled with disgust and pride, and he's really twisted, right? I mean, he's the thoughts that he thinks and the actions that he does are so twisted, but he fills them with a he, as he says in the book, a kind of demonic energy, and the way that he wants a total destruction of the world. He sees nothing of any value. He sees no purpose. He's not even fatalistic. It's almost just this sort of, he wants to just obliterate the world. He wants nothing to have ever existed. And so I'm going to take you through a couple of passages that will sort of bring that out, because just like in Lunar Park, the narrative, I mean, it's interesting because it's like they're the same length. The books are almost the exact same length. The chapters are sort of set up in the same way. The narrative is sort of disjointed in a number of ways. There are gaps in memory, which are typified or exemplified by, ellipses and lowercase beginnings of sentences, and it's become sort of fragmentary as we go through the dark passages of Bateman's mind and his actions. And then towards the end of the novel, we really start racing towards this climax. And it's interesting because there is no real climax, but you feel as if there is a climax, and that's just because of the boiling over of Bateman's emotions, or at least his imitation of emotions. And the other thing to consider about this is that the music, the way that he discusses music is symbolic of a number of things. First of all, he's able to reel off entire verbatim passages straight from a GQ, right, about fashion, about men's style and fashion, about every aspect of it. He's able to reel off these music reviews, which are his, but seem like they're from, they almost read like David Frick verbiage, right? You remember, the famous Rolling Stone music reviewer. And, the satire really comes to a head with the music reviews because, do you like Phil Collins? Do you like Huey Lewis and the News? Do you like Whitney Houston? And the final music review, for instance, in the film, there are more in the book, but the final, and they're more fleshed out in the book. Again, I guess pun intended. But the final section of the film where he has the two women at his apartment, he's at Paul Allen's apartment. Paul Allen is Paul Owen in the book, by the way. He's Paul Allen in the film, I guess, because of Paul Allen, the actual Paul Allen, played by our buddy Jared Leto, who's often been discussed. We mentioned him last time in the Mobius. He's not our buddy. In the Mobius analysis that I did for I guess at the beginning when I was doing, what was that, the Dracula stream. And of course, Jay's analysis, shout out to JD over there, has discussed a number of Jared Leto films, and he plays Paul Allen, who is a mirror, really a mirror of Bateman, and then Bateman himself is a mirror of Marcus Halberstram, and he's called by so many names in the book, you almost lose track. I mean, he's Hamilton, McCloy. Hey, McCloy, right? Hey, Hamilton, have a holly jolly Christmas. Mistletoe alert. And when he's with the two women, one of whom in the film is played by Guinevere Turner, who's the screenwriter for American Psycho, he says, "Do you like Whitney Houston?" And she laughs at him, right? And I think this is funny because the music that he chooses is obviously the pop music of the 80s and is so, I've been getting into character for this stream by listening to Phil Collins for an entire week. I love, and the thing is that Phil Collins' music, and this is what reviewers said at the time, and anybody could get this. It's so catchy. It's so poppy that it seems completely surface level. It's remember when they got rid of, musical, instruments and started using Linn drums and 808s, and Phil Collins was really a pioneer for this for pop music, and it becomes almost synthetic, but there's still a deeper it's not shallow. It's still there is a depth to it because Phil Collins's voice and the words bring it out. But that's interesting because a lot of Phil Collins's songs are purposefully either improvised or totally surface level. I mean, Sussudio, for example, doesn't really mean anything, right? Same with Billy, Don't Lose My Number. It came out of nothing. It was thought up on the spot. It doesn't have there's no driving force behind the song. It's just the words fit. But it's still an amazing song. So what I think Bateman does with his own musical analysis, which is amazing, is that it's completely surface level, but the imitation of a human is so complex in the diction that he chooses and in the words that it almost seems real, if that makes sense. So I think that is a perfect mirror of shouts out to Penny who sends $2. Shouts out to Penny out there. Love you. Thanks, y'all. I love y'all. Thank you for being here tonight. Really appreciate you. Please think about supporting me. Yeah, drop those super chats because I can really use them. I just got a couple more books, by the way, and the next one we'll be doing, the next stream, I think will be, the next stream will, I think it's going to be tomorrow night, and that's going to be the promised 1K subs Caddyshack stream. We're going to be talking about Caddyshack just for fun. It'll just be a fun stream. And then, of course, we'll be doing, next, I think we're going to go back to some classical literature, and we're going to be doing The Tempest, Shakespeare's Tempest, and talking about Prospero, 5 Fathom Deep. And then after that, I'm going to go back to postmodern literature and talk about Don DeLeo's Mao 2, which is a book on conspiracy, right? Shouts out to y'all. Let me drink my, I wish I had a J&B straight and a Corona. No, I'm drinking this GMO. I'm drinking this GMO right here. So shouts out to y'all. Hope y'all are having a good, what is this, Monday night or whatever? I need my energy to cover this Bateman. All right, so first of all, the book opens with, actually even before the book opens, the epigraphs to the book are amazing and revelatory. First of all, he's got, the first epigraph is from Dostoevsky, Notes from the Underground, right? He covers the underground, man. Shouts out to our homeboy, Tristan Haggard, Primal Edge Health. Little AIDS out there who had me on his wonderful, beautiful, stunning, and brave channel to cover the Underground Man. So that was awesome. Thank you so much. Go back and watch that stream if you haven't seen that. Primal Edge Health, Tristan Haggard. And then he also has one from Miss Manners. And that plays a major role in the film. In the book. Not so much in the film, but in the book, Miss Manners. And then finally, the final... let me cover what she says here. One of the major mistakes people make is that they think manners are only the expression of happy ideas. I got a book of Miss Manners in the library in there. There's a whole range of behavior that can be expressed in a mannerly way. That's what civilization is all about, doing it in a mannerly and not an antagonistic way. One of the places we went wrong was the naturalistic Rousseauian movement of the 60s, in which people said, why can't you just say what's on your mind? In civilization, there have to be some restraints. If we follow every impulse, we'd be killing one another. Interesting. Who knew that we could get such a revelatory epigraph from Miss Manners, right? Which really captures the entire essence of, excuse me, folks, which captures the entire essence of, in a number of ways, where we were then and where we are now, right? Now, this is the difference between being nice and being kind, but also the fact that absolute freedom or absolute liberty, as people discuss it, or as, I guess, libertarians discuss it, one can't help but lead to the logical end, which is the freedom to do anything. And I don't mean the freedom to do anything without consequences in that sense. I just mean that is how Bateman takes it. I mean, Bateman is really the ultimate libertarian in a sense, right? Because he can do anything he wants without without consequences. Now, he is not I guess he's not a libertarian because he's in a way, he's at the top of the pyramid. Where he comes from, what he does, what he likes to do. But in the sense that he is able to indulge every whim, every aspect, every base desire without consequence. And he tests that in a number of ways. In fact, that's pretty true to how serial killers have discussed. One of the ways in which they do their thing is that, they find that no one's catching them. They're not, so they continue to push the boundaries. I think we saw that with Berkowitz talked about that in his Son of Sam interview. And hold on, sorry, I'm shaking the camera. And the final epigraph is from the Talking Heads, right? And as things fell apart, nobody paid much attention. And Talking Heads, right? The psycho killer. I guess if any music really does exemplify Bateman's mentality, it would be the Talking Heads, because Talking Heads are. Have you seen that film? Have you guys seen the film Stop Making Sense? It's really, it's one of the great concert films. It's amazing. It's an amazing concert film, and the reason is because, it's like Talking Heads are this 80s, late 70s, and then into the 80s art rock band, which somehow appeals to, prep school, Ivy League culture, right? And I think it's because obviously it's the rhythm and the catchiness of the music, but it's also there's this like dichotomy between the lyrics and the music. Right, the lyrics can often be dark, and the music is upbeat, and so there's this like disjointed aspect to the music, to Talking Heads, and and Stop Making Sense, right? Remember how David Byrne like starts off with the suit, and then the suit gets larger and larger and larger, right? And it becomes this sort of grotesque, like man in an ill-fitting suit who's wearing like I guess probably going too far with this, but wearing the corporate identity of an entire culture that like doesn't seem to fit him, or at least one person. But it's also weird. Another thing about Talking Heads, just of interest, is that this is gonna sound so weird, but my prep school chaplain / lacrosse coach was the brother of the bass player for the Talking Heads. Isn't that weird? That's so weird. That's such a weird connection. Her name's Tina Weymouth, the bass player, and he's her brother. So anyway, he was a vicious lacrosse coach, by the way. He was wild. And he would, when we would scrimmage, he would play. He would insist on playing, and he carried like an all wood defensive stick and wore no pads. And he would tell everybody to hit him as hard as they could. Yeah, no, check me. You got to be tough. Anyway, and the other thing is, I was telling Jeff, shouts out to our homeboy Jethro out there, Kang. I was telling Jeff that I saw David Byrne one time at the MoMA in New York. I lived in New York for a year, and I saw David Byrne in there, like being David Byrne. He was so David Byrne. He looks like nobody else. Like, first of all, it was at the MoMA, and he was like going through a modern art exhibit with like some hangers-on who were, they were discussing the high art of, I don't know, Basquiat or somebody. And he just like looked like David Byrne, shock of white hair, right? So anyway, let's talk about the opening of the novel. April Fools, right, which is interesting because that reminds me of Phoenix Program. I guess Phoenix Program, they would say trick or treat, right? But April Fools, it begins, so already the name of the first chapter is April Fools, and we don't know. So what we get from that is this a joke, right? Are the things that we're about to read based in sort of half-truths? And Bateman is the unreliable narrator of all unreliable narrators. That's like one of the brilliant things that Ellis does here, because This is like a higher level of prose, and drawing the reader into this like labyrinthine world, because we don't know whether the things that we're reading are truthful. They are truthful, but we don't know whether they're factual or not. We don't know whether he is like, we're in on the joke, or whether like he is actually being misidentified by people, or this is just his sentiment and how he feels about it. But I think that, again, there's like two truths, right? It's like an Apocalypse Now Redux, right? There are two of you, one that loves and one that kills. And if it's not factual in the sense that he's actually doing these horrible things, it's true in the sense that he wishes that he could, or that he would be doing them if he allowed himself to be, or even if he is doing them, nobody's noticing and nobody cares. So the first opening of the book says, of course, and this is Dante's Inferno. So, it's like if this were a course, if we were in a course right now, we would have done most of the prerequisite work for covering this book. We would have led to this point, because we've done, and this is by accident, of course, or through happenstance, or through just through intertextuality, right? Because we did Dante's Inferno, right? Zonal Abyss. We did The Underground Man. We've done music analysis. We've done Lunar Park, which is kind of a sequel to this. But it informs the book in a way that you could read that before you read this. So we've done a bunch of work that will help us to understand this really complex novel. He starts off with, of course, the most infamous part of Dante's Inferno, right? When they enter the city of Dis. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here, is scrawled in blood red lettering on the side of the chemical bank near the corner of 11th and 1st, and is in print large enough to be seen from the back seat of the cab as it lurches forward in the traffic, leaving Wall Street. And just as Timothy Price notices the words, a bus pulls up, the advertisement for Les Miserables on its side, blocking his view. But Price, who is with Pearson Pierce and 26, doesn't seem to care, because he tells the driver he will give him $5 to turn up the radio, Be My Baby, on WYNN. And the driver, black, not American, does so. Whoa. Crazy first sentence. The entire first sentence of the book is a paragraph. And it's not a run-on sentence, right? It's almost informed by a sort of a Beat Generation holy contour of life kind of on the road rolling. I mean, we're literally on the road because we're in the back of the cab, but he's going to take it in a completely different place. And one thing that's brilliant also is that it's almost a prose poem, because remember that verse is written in lines. Okay, prose is written in paragraphs. But one thing interesting about the publication of the book is that the first part of that sentence is an actual line, like it's a line of verse. So it begins with abandon all hope, ye who enter here, and then it ends with is scrawled in blood. So we think it's literally scrawled in blood is what we get just subconsciously while we're reading this, right? We see the words that Satan has written above the city of Dis as we're entering a hell zone, but then it shifts in the next line, and it's not an actual next line because this is prose. It's not a line of verse, but the construction of the book and the page just allow that to happen. Blood, next line, red lettering. So it's not blood, it's blood red lettering. On the side of the chemical bank, interesting pun on, the chemical bank is a real bank, but interesting pun on chemical because of first of all, the amount of drugs and excess in the book is pretty awesome, awesome in the sense that it's staggering. It fills you with awe and a sense of sort of dark wonder as you go through it, because that's it's just a consequence of how they live, right? Near the corner of 11th and 1st, right? And then we get this other character, Price, who's Bryce, again, in the film. So we're already introduced to the other character. Notice that we don't get a sense of a first-person narrator. So in the second we don't get the fact that this is a first-person narrator until later on in the chapter. So, in other words, we know that there is a character, Bateman. We know that from our sort of prior context of the novel, but we don't understand yet that it's not third person. Like, if you didn't know anything about the book, you would assume at this point that this is a third-person narrator. And what that does is it gives you a sense of dislocation, right? A sense of the misidentity of the character. It's like he is seeing things from a sort of a God's eye view, but he's down on the street. And then when we get the advertisement for Les Mis plays an interesting role in this because Les Mis, produced by Cameron McIntosh, who I met one time at the 50th anniversary for Les Mis, which he did at my drama school. He came to drama school for this big fundraiser thing with Jeremy Irons. Anyway, Les Mis sort of typifies the big Broadway of the 1980s, and also the fact that Bateman is obsessed with Les Mis. I've got a 10:30 matinee at Les Mis, right? I got a lunch with Cliff Huxtable at the Four Seasons in 15 minutes, right? But that he's miserable. Remember that his first reflection in the film is he wakes up, he's about to do his routine, he goes in the bathroom, and we see him standing there, and we see his reflection in the mirror, in a mirror picture of a framed poster of the Les Mis production, right? So we see the poster, and we see the face, and then we see his face like staring back at us, and that's one of the things that's interesting about Bateman as we go on, because he doesn't recognize the face that is staring back at him because he's like out of body, right? But at the same time, he's always staring at his reflection. There's one part that's really, really significant, revelatory, well written, and it reminds me of the scene. Remember the Gnostic scene in Westworld season 2 that I discussed before, where Delios is in the fishbowl, right? And he's doing his. They're trying to transhumanate him, right? They're trying to load his consciousness into a new form of his body so that he can live forever. But he has to go through the testing, right? And he keeps dying because he keeps malfunctioning. But he at one point goes crazy or inhabits his true self, which is that he takes a mirror and cuts his face, and then when they go in to confront him, right, and they shoot him, and he's lying there, and he says, they told me there were two fathers, one above, one below. They lied. It was I was looking up from the bottom of a well. There was only the devil smiling back down at you, right, which is absolutely Gnostic. And the same sort of thing happens where Bateman sees his reflection in a pool of blood and looks back up at himself and then goes into this sort of totally hellish commentary on his wishes for the annihilation of the world. We also get where he works in this. We get a mention of, locust. We get the WYNN, which is also a pun because it reminds one of Corporate Raiders and Steve Wynn, and also I think it's Steve Wynn's son, or at least his fictional son in the book, he comes into the scene one time. I noticed all of the names in the book. I mean, you can't help but notice all of the names that come in and out. One of the names that is mentioned in the film a few times, right, is that Donald Trump? Damn it, Marcus. Why would Ivana Trump be a Texarkana? Bateman's idol is Don Trump. He mentions him like continuously throughout the novel, and that's you don't really get a sense of that in the movie because it becomes a different thing. But like whenever anybody says, let's go to Barcadia, right? Let's go to Indochine or whatever, and Bateman's like, nobody goes there anymore. And then they say Donald Trump's going to be there, and he says, really, we're going. He walks past the Trump Tower and looks up at the sort of golden babble of it and wonders. His dream is to be invited to a Don Trump party or aboard Don Trump's yacht. It's really something. It's called, we do a little trolling. Sometimes we do a little trolling. We also get his hints of the racial commentary that occurs in the book, which plays a major role. And actually, one of the things that I got from somebody's thesis from Universidad de Zaragoza. This lady, this academic, wrote I've been to Saragossa in Spain. Does a thesis on American Psycho as postmodern Gothic. This is sort of her précis, I guess, her abstract. And she talks about how Bateman, and this is where it's not bad, but then one thing is, and this is often cited by critics, because the book was let's see, I think it was published by Knopf. No, it was published by Vintage, because they pulled it after publication. Ellis faced he was sort of canceled and early on in 1991, especially by Lemon's Wib, let's say, academics who found the misogyny, what they called the misogyny in the book, to be absolutely heinous. And one of the things that this person, and that sort of still runs throughout commentary of the book, and one of the things is she says, let's see, reproducing the plot of many slasher movies and serial killer movies, American Psycho is the story of Patrick Bateman, a rich white heterosexual yuppie that conceals a sexist, racist, xenophobic serial killer. His victims are mainly women, black people, beggars, children, somohexuals, that is to say, those that he considers under him in his particular social scale. Well, that's kind of true, but not really, because his victims are everyone. He says that blatantly in the novel. He wants everyone to feel his pain. He wants everyone to disappear. It's not necessarily that he hates certain groups of people. It's that he hates everyone. Mainly, I would say, his own people. And that's, of course, that's my own interpretation of that latter part. But the earlier part is in the book. I mean, he wants violence on anyone. Now, who he takes his violence out on, that first part is true in a way. But I would say that that's sort of a misreading of the text. Night, John, thank you for being here. Thank you for being homeboy. I'm not looking at the chat, but I just happened to see that. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you. Please make sure you smash that like. Please think about dropping me a super chat. Don't forget that my Cash App is totally working now. Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, and I'm going to give a shout out to somebody who dropped a fat PayPal earlier today for $20, and I'll do that in a little bit. So thank you so much. Shouts out to all my homeboys out there, especially Jeff, Expo. Okay, shouts out to Okang out there. Shouts out to Penny. Shouts out to AU, Kristen, our homegirl Kristen. Shouts out to everybody out there. Really appreciate y'all. So then we get a long like discourse on fashion, and what I wrote in the notes here, and this is from Bryce. Bryce is the only person that Bateman says he finds interesting, and he is interesting. He's funny, and he's played by Justin Theroux from VA, Nova. He's from Nova, but Justin Theroux, who himself is an awesome screenwriter. And what I wrote is, degradation and filth in Pod City is essentially the sentiment that we get. And of course, there's like I don't know if it's a conscientious allusion to Taxi Driver in this part, but someday a real rain's going to come and wash the scum off the streets. I mean, this is like Taxi Driver, but 10 years later. And not from an ex-Phoenix Project program guy, Travis Bickle, but from a corporate guy. This says, let's see. Let me go on to, they are basically going out, and on page 8, there is a key passage with the what we call the cinematic dissolve. So it says, let's see, let me start on page 7 here. It says, he says, the man passes under the fluorescent glare of a street lamp with a troubled look on his face that momentarily curls his lips into a slight smile, and he glances at Price almost as if they were acquainted. But just as quickly, he realizes that he doesn't know Price. And just as quickly, Price realizes it's not Victor Powell, and the man moves on. This is one of the first cases of misidentification in the book. Everyone's always not who they think they are. And then he says, thank God, Price mutters as he nears Evelyn's. It looks like Evelyn is Bateman's fiance. It looked a lot like him. Powell and dinner at Evelyn's. These two go together about as well as paisley and plaid. Price rethinks this. White socks with gray trousers. A slow dissolve. And Price is bounding up the steps outside the brownstone Evelyn's father bought her, grumbling about how he forgot to return the tapes he rented last night to Video Haven. He rings the bell. At the brownstone next to Evelyn's, a woman, high heels, great ass, leaves without locking her door. Price follows her with his gaze, and when he hears footsteps from inside coming down the hallway, turns toward us. He turns around and straightens his Versace tie, ready to face whoever. Courtney opens the door, and he's wearing a Krizia cream silk blouse, a Krizia rust tweed skirt, and silk satin Dorsey pumps with Manolo Blahnik. I shiver and hand her my black wool Giorgio Armani overcoat, and she takes it from me, carefully air-kissing my right cheek. Then she performs the same exact movements on Price while taking his Armani overcoat. The new Talking Heads on CD play softly in the living room. So, in other words, the slow dissolve here, what that gives an indication of, it's just a few words in the text, okay? But what it does is it shows us that, first of all, it's a pun. Do you get the dark pun? The pun is on the fact that the dissolve is supposed to bookend or mirror the bodies dissolving in an apartment in Hell's Kitchen that Bateman owns. That's his like murder palace. And he mentions that specifically in the book. The other thing is that it's a cinematic dissolve. So the book is written with a kind of it's cinematic in quality because we get kind of a camera's eye view of not only the day-to-day particulars and every concrete detail of fashion and style, but we also get this cinematic view of the way things are supposed to move in a movie. In fact, Bateman will later go on towards the end of the novel to say that it doesn't feel real. He feels like he's in a movie. Now, this is important because this gets at another layer of what Ellis does with the narrative, and that is, that it's the same thing as in A Clockwork Orange. Both are books about psychopaths, right? And both have this sort of dissociation between what they are seeing as real and what is actually real in terms of it's slightly different in the way that Alex DeLarge will do these heinous acts literally. Like he will, go on these ultra-violent sprees, ultra-violence, right? But he will not feel it. He has no emotion about it. Right, it's almost like there's a disconnect between the act, between the, what does he say in The Hollow Men? T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men. He says the act and I can't remember, but The Hollow Men hints at that, and the form and the function essentially. And Bateman, on the other hand, feels the things that he does, but there's a dislocation because he doesn't feel like he actually feels it. He feels it, but he doesn't care, if that makes sense. And the dissolve is like the world sort of dissolving before him, and he sees everything like sort of like through a mirror, right? Through a glass darkly, or through the looking glass. I'm going to skip to a key passage here, which is there's one of the motifs in the book is this fictional Patty Winters show, and he'll make sort of continuous references to that, and he'll say today on Patty Winters, the show was about, and this is a reference to like Geraldo. I'm not gonna say my thoughts about Geraldo. Because I'm gonna be polite here. Geraldo, Oprah Winfrey / what's his name, Donahue. You remember when Oprah had on Michael Aquino, right? And it's that sort of thing. It's this sort of like yellow press, page 6, like tabloid way of looking at the world, where everything is just murder and death and just like absurd destruction. And he says on page 29, he says, an extended waist cut is cut slightly higher in the front. Tabs make the suspenders fit well at the center back. The tie is a dotted silk design by Valentino Couture. The shoes are crocodile loafers by A. Testoni. While I'm dressing, the TV is kept on to the Patty Winters show. Today's guests are women with multiple personalities. Interesting. A nondescript, overweight, older woman is on the screen, and Patty's voice is heard asking, well, is it schizophrenia or what's the deal? Tell us. Oh, no. Multiple personalities are not schizophrenics, the woman says, shaking her head. We are not dangerous. Well, Patty starts, standing in the middle of the audience, microphone in hand. Who were you last month? Last month, it seemed to be mostly Polly, the woman says. Well, this month, I'm lamb chop, mostly lamb chop. The shoes I'm wearing are crocodile loafers by A. Testoni. Grabbing my raincoat out of the closet in the entranceway, I find a Burberry scarf and matching coat with a whale embroidered on it, something a little kid might wear, and it's covered with what looks like dried chocolate syrup crisscrossed over the front, darkening the lapels. I take the elevator downstairs to the lobby, rewinding my Rolex by gently shaking my wrist. I say good morning to the doorman, step outside, and hail a cab, heading downtown toward Wall Street. When the next passage starts, Harry's. This is one of their bars. This is like, what's the bar in New York that everyone goes to? Dorian's? I think it's Dorian's. Dorian's is the bar everyone goes to in the Upper West Side. This is like that. Harry's. Price and I walk down Hanover Street in the darkest moments of twilight, as if guided by radar, move silently toward Harry's. That passage right there, the way that he moves about the night, is another sort of prerequisite that we did, which is, remember we did the psychotic poet Robert Frost and his Acquainted with the Night. I've been one acquainted with the night. I've gone out, I've come back, and remember the story of Jack the Ripper, essentially, as Robert Frost walking around in the night, only seeing the illuminated clock against the sky, hearing the screams. And we also just did Jack the Ripper, by the way. He says, let's see, they get there and they meet Lewis Carruthers, who is the fake and gray guy that is obsessed with Bateman. Your compliment was sufficient, Lewis. Remember that part? A lot of the language, I wish I could say a lot of the language in here, but of course I can't. In fact, I didn't even monetize this stream because the terms are too much for the certain people, so we can't do that. But suffice it to say, they say all the things that you would think that they would say. One of the things that occurs in the beginning of the book is that and the reason that I sort of refuted this paper is that his friends make mention of the fact that there's a rumor going around that Bateman is fake and gray. And if you know what I mean, and it borders on it. This sort of borders on the. I would say there's a truth to it in a way, in that, you expect these, alpha bros, it's just the dudes being dudes to make jokes like this sitting around, right? But it sort of goes past that in the length in which they describe it. Bateman has some good comebacks, though. And remember, Bateman himself brings this up when he's talking about the disappearance of Paul Allen with Donald Kimball, right? He was part of that whole Yale thing. Yale thing? What do you mean Yale thing? Well, I mean, he was probably a Hazit clomosexual who did a lot of cocaine. That whole Yale thing, right? Where did he hang out? Harry's, Flutie's, Indochine, New York Yacht Club, right? So I'm not sure, Ellis, and I don't like to usually discuss as part of this our analyses like what the authors themselves say about the work, because I think it can be misleading, and oftentimes, like we said in the last one and a few other streams, they don't, the author will not have an understanding of their own work that they created. But actually, Ellis, I think, is so clued into these things that I read one thing where one interview where he discussed the fact that the reason that he liked the American Psycho film was because they brought out aspects of the story that he himself didn't realize he had written. Okay, and what I mean is that the great writer it's not ambiguity, but they will write in a sort of a multi-leveled function where the reader can oftentimes interpret not based on anything, not based on nothing, rather, not based on their opinions, but based on the sort of tangential and multi-leveled signposts within the narrative. And he did say that, they questioned him about his hexusality, and he said that, he didn't want to discuss it. I mean, you could probably figure, but he didn't want to discuss it because if he said that he was one way, then people would read American Psycho the other way. And then if he said he was one way, for example, with Lunar Park or Less Than Zero, then they would read it another way. So the two kind of flip. He says, let's see, on page, I thought that the schizoidal aspect and the dissociation aspect were important and clues into Bateman's identity. I mean, remember in the film when he is in there with Paul Allen and he goes into the bathroom and he takes that pill? Well, it turns out in the book, I think a lot of people wonder what that pill is because they'll look at the label, and the label is it just says his name and his address. In the book, it's Valium. But I would say that he exhibits signs of schizophrenia in a number of ways, especially in how he acts with his friends. And his friends play it off as, this guy's wild. He's a madman, an absolute madman, says the guy at the end. But Bateman's idea of humor is always to bring up serial killers and he's encyclopedic in his knowledge He's encyclopedic in his knowledge of serial killers, fashion, music, etc. And here's an instance of misidentity again, page 36. And it's also interesting because you could read this book as purely a guidebook on how to dress if you're a gentleman with a lot of money, I guess. And he says on page 36, "Who is that?" Price asked, staring over the table. "Is that Reed Robinson?" And by the way, Preston, you simply have a tab with a buttonhole sewn into the front of the shirt, which can then be attached by a button to your trousers, and make sure that the stiff pleated front of the shirt doesn't extend below the waistband of your trousers, or it will rise up when you sit down. Now, is that jerk Reed Robinson? He looks a hell of a lot like him. And so he was talking there about how one can go about wearing black tie and not have the pleated front of the shirt rise up and fold. So you sew a button in under the cummerbund. Anyway, let's see. On page 43, they talked about Hamp Sydney. There's a number. I found this to be personally interesting. There's a number of VA references in this. One is Hamp Sydney College in Virginia. Private boys. Well, it's not boys, but it's all male private college, and also they mentioned Rollins College. Shouts out to Rollins in Florida, and also Sweetbriar, Sweetbriar, and then the various private schools. Like Bateman went to Exeter, he went to Phillips Exeter, and then he went to Harvard and Harvard Business School. But like Phillips Exeter, Andover, Choate is mentioned. Oh, he went to Choate. What else? I don't think Lawrenceville is mentioned. But there are a number of different private schools, and he says at one point at the end of the book that he doesn't know when he became the way he was. Probably at Harvard, he says. And this says on page 43, they're talking about a girl who walks in. College, I ask a joke, Price hints. Rollins, I guess. Get this, McDermott. Rollins is in Winter Park, Florida. Great school. Get this, McDermott says. Hampton, Sydney. He's a parasite, a loser, a weasel, Van Patten concludes. But they're talking about this dude, not the girl. But he's worth $800 million, McDermott goes on emphatically. Go over and give the dwarf head. Will that shut you up, Price says. I mean, how impressed can you get, McDermott? Anyway, I mentioned, nice babe. That girl is hot, McDermott agrees. Affirmative. Price nods, but grudgingly. Oh, man, Van Patten says, distressed. I know that chick. Oh, bullshit, we all moan. Let me guess, I say. Picked her up at Tunnel, right? No, he says. Then after sipping his drink, she's a model, anorexic, alcoholic, uptight bitch, totally French. What a joke you are, I say, unsure if he's lying. Want to bet? So what, McDermott shrugs. Yeah. She drinks a liter of Stoli a day, then throws it up and re-drinks it, McDermott, Van Patten explains. Total alky. Total cheap alky, Price murmurs. I don't care, McDermott says bravely. She is beautiful. I want to marry her. I want her to have my children. Oh, Jesus, Van Patten says, practically gagging. Who wants to marry a chick who's going to give birth to a jug of vodka and cranberry juice? He has a point, I say. Yeah. Yeah, it goes on. It's just the dudes being dudes, just sitting there talking about this chick. But then it turns out that the girl is she's from a Virginia tobacco family, I think, and she's got old money, right? Which puts her, I don't know if it puts her above Bateman. I mean, we did our stream on The Great Gatsby, right? Jeff Steineffrey and The Great Gatsby. But these guys are also old money, I guess. I mean, Bateman. We don't know much about Bateman's family, but we know that he was born into it, right? DJ says Tunnel was a dodgy nightclub in Melbourne. It's probably a dodgy nightclub anywhere. I mean, I keep thinking of, they don't mention the Mud Club. That was probably already gone. The Mud Club was like that punk club that was like also, you know, when these guys are kind of slumming it and they go down to the places like the Bowery. And that's where the artist Basquiat got his start. But he was a musician there playing sort of samples. And there's one part where they say, should we go to CBGB's? And they're like, oh no. Page 45 is where the great scene happens. It says, but it doesn't occur like it does in the book. Suddenly the restaurant seems far away, hushed, the noise distant, a meaningless hum compared to this card. And we all hear Price's words, brazed lettering, pale nimbus, white. Holy shit, Van Patten exclaims. I've never seen nice. Very nice, I have to admit. But wait, let's see Paul Allen's card, right? But in this, it's let's see Montgomery's. Price pulls it out, and though he's acting nonchalant, I don't see how he can ignore it. It's subtle off-white coloring. It's tasteful thickness. I'm unexpectedly depressed that I started this. So, you know, Bateman's anxiety attacks, which he calls himself anxiety attacks, are on the, Max's Kansas City, right, where Velvet Underground got started, are like instances of where the things that he cares the deepest, about, the things he cares about the most that drive him like crazy are the absolute most surface of all surface things, like especially the business card. Remember the business card, how big the business card was in the 80s, right? They talk about how the Japanese will rule this entire country by the end of the decade. Remember in the 80s and 90s when like the Japanese businessman, which later transitioned into the new China, right? The new China, the Chinese billionaire. But in the 80s and 90s, it was all Japanese. Remember all of the movies that came out about the Japanese corporate, Nakatomi Plaza, right? Rising Sun, Black Rain, all of these like movies about the Japanese businessman and the like sort of totemistic aspect of the business card. But what that plays into, I mean, look at this card, right? This is the most surface thing. This is like, this thing became this symbol of identity and wealth where it says who you are. And it's like, it's not only the business card itself and who you work for, but it's like the font and the letters and just the texture of the paper and the tasteful thickness of it, right? It becomes this symbolic aspect of like the littlest thing that is completely surface. There is no depth, but the depth is like what you read into it. On pages 60 and 61, they go to the meatpacking district in New York, which when I lived in New York was still like, that it was like still, I don't know if it is now, but that's like, where all the clubs are. That's where Crowbar and Marquee and all these places are. But it's different in the 80s, like, because what that symbolizes is like you have, celebrity and wealth and decadence, like, and opulence, but in the midst of, like the previous, the prior working class, and the like surrounded by filth. It's almost like these people are at these places where they're in the Delios fishbowl where everybody else has to look on, but they're not allowed through the looking glass. Right. On page 60, he says, he looks away from me, doesn't answer, just keeps staring past the railings, trying to find the point where the tracks come to an end. Find what lies behind the blackness. He's becoming a drag, but Owen seems worse, and I've already accidentally made eye contact with the weasel. And what that shows me is Bateman's one of the revelatory little bits in the book before we get to the major ones about vacancy. He sees the horizon as like this fixed point of nothingness, right? Where if one turns it back on oneself and he looks at the point between his eyes, you see, an empty shell, right? Or a place that's inhabited by something else. On page 74, we get the first mention of Dorsia. Dorsia symbolizes the height of like where they want to go and the thing that even Bateman can't attain, right? Which is, this exclusive restaurant where one can never get a reservation. Remember when he calls Dorsia? Yeah. And remember when before the scene with Paul Allen in the office in the film, right? Hey, Paul, squash, no can do. Got an 8:30 res at Dorsia. Sea urchin ceviche, great. 8:30 res at Dorsia on a Friday night. How'd he swing that? No one goes there anymore. Bateman says everyone goes to Dorsia. Remember when he asked Jean, who's in love with him? He says continuously, played by Chloe Sevigny in the film. Where do you want to go? Where does Jean want to go? Dorsia? So, Jean wants to go to Dorsia. This horrifies Bateman because he knows he can't get a res. He can't get a res at Dorsia. So he calls Dorsia and, I need a reservation for 8 or 8:30. We're totally booked. No, we're totally booked. And remember when he calls, when he's in his apartment, he's watching like, in the background. And he calls for the Dorsia reservation. They just laugh at him. Well, one thing that occurs in the book that's different from the film is, Patrick, you didn't give them a name. They know me there, right? He actually does take her to Dorsia. And when they get there, he knows he doesn't have a reservation. He's really playing it like fast and loose here, right? And he sees a name on the reservation list, which is like Schwartz. And he tells them that he's got a reservation. So they go and they sit down, and then he gets called out. The maitre d' comes over and says, sir, we know you're not. And he loses face, right, tying into the Japanese aspect of the corporate culture. He loses face, and And what happens is Bateman, this is like one of the great like human moments in this where you think Bateman is actually going to change, and he himself thinks he's going to change. He gets up and he walks out, and he's totally defeated. He's lost face in front of Jean, and Jean is way lower down than him. Like, she's his assistant, right? And remember, he has to tell her how to dress. Next time, wear high heels. I like high heels. And he says, come on, Jean, you're better than that, right? Well, instead of like switching roles where she now has something over on him, right? Where she's now, he's been defeated in front of her. They go outside and she laughs. She's laughing. And he's like, what are you laughing about? She's like, that was so funny. That was such a great idea. That was brilliant. That was the most spontaneous thing you've ever done, Patrick. And he, for a brief moment in time, he starts to imagine leaving his life, right? Like leaving everything he has and going away. He's got money. He can do whatever he wants. He could leave and never come back. In fact, that is one interpretation of kind of what happens to Paul Allen, right? Because if Bateman, hasta la vista, baby, I'm off to London for a few days, right? If Paul Allen isn't murdered by Bateman, literally, then he goes off to London, and Donald Kimball says, actually, yes. And then remember, he meets with the lawyer at the end, and the lawyer says, I had dinner with Paul Allen 10 days ago. But see, again, it's the ambiguity of it, because nobody recognizes anybody else. Paul thinks that Bateman is Marcus, right? They have they go to the same tailor, they go to the same barber, although I have a slightly better haircut. He wears Oliver Peoples glasses just like he does. They look exactly alike. Everybody looks alike. And it's not only that they look alike, it's that nobody cares about anybody else's death. I mean, Bateman, one of the funny things throughout the book is that Bateman is always like, he's like answering when people call him the other names. He never corrects them. And I thought, reading the book, that this would just be a thing that would go sort of, there would be no attention paid to this. But actually what happens is that he at one point says to, I think it's to Evelyn, he says something about like, nobody knows me, nobody knows anybody, nobody knows anybody else. And so he recognizes that nobody recognizes anybody else, right? And with Jean, he's like, we should go, we should run, we should leave. We should just leave and go away. We could, and, he imagines like for a minute having a life with her. And what he says is, let me see if I can find the passage. I think I marked it out. He says, he just wants to be loved, which is a completely different level of depth than one would expect in this book. I mean, it's like the resolution to the entire novel, right, is that it's just nothingness. But what Bateman wants is something real and substantial, which is to be loved. There's a scene where he meets with his mother. And you expect there actually in the book to be these family scenes, because he does meet with his brother Sean Bateman, his brother Sean, who is in Rules of Attraction, right, which is James Vanderbeek. He's really good, actually, in the movie Rules of Attraction. But in the book, there's a scene where they go to New York and they're talking about Patrick. And Sean, he says, Sean comes into this novel, and Sean is like basically a jet-setting, he's just like a jet-setting degenerate. He's a drug dealer. He just, goes to parties in Monaco. And they have like a weird relationship. They have this kind of antagonistic relationship. But what it actually reminded me of a lot was the Menendez brothers, because I think that is probably what, I'm reading into this, and this is my interpretation, but I think that the reason that Patrick is the way that he is probably because his parents perhaps did something to him when he was younger. And remember, that was part of the Menendez brothers defense in their trial. Remember the famous Menendez brothers trial in L.A., where they were these two kids who their dad was a financier tied in with Holly Weird, and they claimed as part of their defense that their dad had been doing creeper things to them for a long time, and that their mother stood by and watched. And that's what was alleged. I would say that seems to probably be the case, and I think that a similar thing probably happens to Bateman. Just because of what we know about DID and serial killers and Phoenix and the ways in which the pyramid, manifests itself down the line, and their methods of control, and their sort of generational Satanism and all these things. And there's a scene where he goes and talks to his mother. He's put his mother in a home. Of course, she's in a $10,000 a week home, but he just sits there and sort of answers questions and, negates everything and then leaves. It's absolutely, there's no substance. Let's see. Let's go to some of the more revelatory passages here. He says, one thing I found on page 97, he says, the waiter, Scott, Ann, and even Courtney, they all stare at me as if I've offered some kind of diabolical, apocalyptic observation, as if I were shattering a myth highly held or destroying an oath that was solemnly regarded. Interesting, the language there, because do you know what the argument is about? The argument is the dialectical argument. They're arguing about Coke versus Pepsi, literally. And he's talking about how he says Pepsi's better because of the something about the chemicals in Coke, which is interesting because it turns out that probably, I can't say that, but we know about the Pepsi drink. But him he's talking about the sort of dividing line dialectic in the absolutely surface advertising, right? And the fact that he uses the language of diabolical apocalyptic revelation is interesting, because that's exactly what he has. He has he has an anxiety attack on page 98 where he says, "Listen, I say, my voice trembling with emotion, have whatever you want, but I'm telling you I recommend the Diet Pepsi." I look down at my lap. In the blue cloth napkin, the words deck chairs sewn into the napkin's edge, and for a moment think I'm going to cry. My chin trembles and I can't swallow. Courtney is in a lithium-induced stupor. Well, then they talk about art, and he says, I think his work, it has a kind of wonderfully proportioned, purposefully mock superficial quality. Do you get the psychopathy in that he is commenting on, right? The wonderfully proportioned, purposefully mock superficial quality. And that is what the narrative is, right? They go on to talk about L.F. Rothschild and P&P. We have graphic sex scenes, and then we have him doing his first, shedding first blood, which is not until page 104. And the next day he is hungover on a Coke binge, wearing Yves Saint Laurent, going to a matinee of Les Mis. We have the misidentity again on page 111. On page 112, he says he goes to the videotape store, right? The movie store, the movie gallery. And he says, there are too many fucking movies to choose from. Excuse my language, folks. That's a quote from the book. I duck behind a promotional cardboard display for the new Dan Aykroyd comedy and take 2 5-milligram Valiums, washing them down with the Diet Pepsi. Then, almost by rote, as if I've been programmed, I reach for Body Double, a movie I rented 37 times, and walk up to the counter where I wait for 20 minutes to be checked out by a dumpy girl, 5 pounds overweight, dry frizzy hair. She's actually wearing a baggy, nondescript sweater, definitely not designer, probably to hide the fact that she has even though she has nice eyes. So fucking what? Finally, it's my turn. I hand her the empty boxes. Then they get in an argument because he tells her something about, he says, do you have any movies with Jamie Gertz? And this is kind of a self-reference because Jamie Gertz is in. Here's Jamie Gertz right here. Jamie Gertz is the actress who played the girlfriend in Less Than Zero, and he gets mad because the girl has no clue who Jamie Gertz is. Now, this is interesting because the only times that Bateman is called out in the book, there are really 3 times. One is the maitre d', one is the videotape girl, and the other is at the end when there's a cabbie. And all of these people basically say no to him, and that's what really drives him insane. He can't stand people saying no. Everything in his life, no one ever says no, especially in his own world, right? Everything they do is he has no consequences, right? But when he meets with regular people, they don't give a shit what he has to say. They don't care about Jamie Gertz. They don't care about movies or wearing Yves Saint Laurent. The girl's wearing a sweatshirt, so what, right? But to him, that represents a lower human. Yeah, okay, says she was in Lost Boys. Michael, Death by Stereo. Awesome. Yeah, she's in Lost Boys. Good call, okay. Let's see. I'm going to skip way ahead here to... I'm going to skip over I'm not going to read the text of any of the murder scenes because there's absolutely no way that I can read that. You can read them for yourself. You can watch the film. But they are graphic. And really, it's interesting because they only take up a few pages in the novel. I mean, they take up probably less than a dozen pages in the novel, but they overwhelm the novel in the sense that they are so graphic. They are absolutely disturbing and graphic, especially one. There's one scene towards the end of the book. I'm not going to say what it involves, but it is so bad. It is so bad and so disturbing in its depiction of the callous, it's just the worst. Okay. And I'm not going to give any details of it, but what it says is that it verges on I mean, it's obviously it's surreal. It verges on unreality. All of them are surreal. And so I haven't really discussed much about why I think both things are true. But what I think is that it's not unrealistic that these types of people are doing these types of things. There have been plenty of real life stories about this. Remember the financier guy who had the top 10 floors of the penthouse at a certain building in New York, and it turns out that he had a DUNGEON, right, where he was doing those things to those women. That's one instance. Okay, there are many of them, and remember the Ronald Bernard videos, right? Remember I mean, so what I'm saying here is that I think that there are instances in the book where the things are fantasy. For instance, him continuously using Paul Allen or Paul Owen's apartment, right, and keeping Dahmer parts in the fridge, and then using nailing them to walls, and he does really awful things. Is either total fantasy because he's called out, again, a person who calls him out, who is almost an angel in a way, because he goes there to look at the apartment because now it's for rent again. So he meets with the real estate agent, and the real estate agent says, "I think that you should go." Right? She says, "You need to leave. Don't come back here." So it's like he's being expelled from his Eden. Right? It's just that his Eden is this murderous haven of Satan blood, and he's not given a reason for this, and so. The ambiguity here is that either this is complete fantasy, right, and he never did these things, and he never went to Paul Allen's apartment, or he did go to Paul Allen's apartment and he imagined that he did these things, or he did them and somehow he's cleaned up and he doesn't realize because he has time gaps and he doesn't understand his own sense of what he did in his dissociation, right? Or that he's in this world of, like, he's in sort of another dimension. He's in like a metaphysical dimension where he is engaged, he's engaged in this blood play, and now he's being expelled for his violations, if that makes sense. I know that that's a pretty extensive analysis or interpretation of what he does in terms of the dark things in the book, but I don't think that, even if it's all fantasy, the sentiment is still true, right? And the sentiment is a result and a reaction of what he does in the other aspects of his life, right? With no surface. With all surface, with no depth, with no care, with no love, with no kindness, with no virtue. Greed and disgust. He says, let's see. He mentions Trump again on page, let's see, I think 137. His analysis of Phil Collins is interesting because, again, this is what the great writer does. Like, the words that he uses, the choice, the diction, right? The word choice, all has a symbolism that ties into other aspects of the novel. For instance, when he's talking about Phil Collins and Invisible Touch, right, in Genesis, 1986, Invisible Touch. I remember when that came out, by the way. Listen, I was like 6 or 7 when these songs came out, and I remember I was okay. So I was on swim team, and there was this girl that, like, I was in love with. I was 6 years old, and I loved the song. I loved the song Invisible Touch because I was spending the night at my friend's house, and there were 4 of us there, and we were we had the tape by Genesis, and we put it on, and we loved it because we thought we played it over and over because we thought he said she must have an invisible touch shit. We thought that he said the word shit in it, so we would yell the word shit as loud as we could until my friend Andrew's mom said we couldn't yell that anymore. But then I loved the song Susudio because the first time I heard it, I was at swim team. I guess they were playing it outside or something, and there was this girl that I loved, and so I would always play that song. Anyway, whatever. Sorry. Let's see. On page. So on page 192, people start to refer to him as devil. And it starts to happen more and more. Come on, you devil. You're a devil. And that starts to that's really where the narrative starts driving into up to the climax. He watches an interview with Donald Trump. Page 257, I wrote, let's see. Okay, this is great. Okay, so first of all, he says, let's see, digit pudding. Okay, so it says dinner with secretary. Monday night at 8 o'clock, I'm in my office attempting yesterday's New York Times Sunday crossword puzzle, listening to rap music on stereo, trying to fathom its popularity. Since a blonde hardbody I met at O-Bar 2 nights ago told me that rap is all she listens to. And though later he did something I'm not going to say, at the apartment in the Dakota building, right on Central Park, right, where Jonathan Lennon was killed, right, by Mark David Chapman. Remember, we did our Catcher in the Rye stream. He says he decapitated her. Hardly a strange experience for me. Earlier that morning, her taste in music haunted my memory. It's interesting that her taste in music is what haunts his memory and not the girl, right? And I had to stop at Tower Records on the Upper West Side and buy $90 worth of rap CDs. But as I expected, I'm at a loss. He says the voices are uttering ugly words like digit, pudding, chunk. Then he watches an exclusive interview with Donald Trump. Donald Trump. Then he says on page 257, he says, and cancel, then spend minutes debating about what I should do with the rest of the evening. Looking out my window, I realize that within moments, the sky above the city will be completely dark. Jean places a file on top of the desk before asking, doing the crossword, dropping the G in doing, a pathetic gesture of intimacy, an irritating stab at forced friendliness. I gag inwardly, then nod without looking up at her. It's interesting how, I mean, Ellis is like so good. He's so specific that even the little hints in the diction show the absolute mania that Bateman has, his contempt for other people, right? In one singular sound, in one syllable, in one letter of a word, and that sort of drives him manic. He's sitting there. I've already filled in every space with either the word meat or bone. And she emits only a slight gasp when noticing this. And when she sees the pile of number 2 pencils I've snapped in half lying on my desk, she dutifully picks them up and walks out of the room. That's when he asks her to where she wants to go. Where does Jean want to go? She wants to go to Dorsia. On page, she says, that was funny. That was so spontaneous. And I'm thinking, dare to dream, right? I'm in a daze, millions of miles away. And Jean doesn't notice. Then on page 283, we get something. Sitting across from Jean right now in the darkness of Arcadia, because they end up going to Arcadia. It's very easy to believe that she would swallow any kind of misinformation I push her way. The crush she has on me rendering her powerless, and I find this lack of defense oddly unerotic. I could even explain my pro-apartheid stance and have her find reasons why she too should share them and invest large sums of money in racist corporations. And then he cuts it off. In other words, this is one of the only instances where we get that his business acumen, right? Where he's doing the Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman here, talking about why he invests in certain companies in order to dominate and destroy. Right, all dispassionately. Remember that movie, The International? Jay did an analysis of that with Clive Owen. Great movie, actually, really underrated, where they're talking about, that's what the movie's about, right? The financing of both sides of a revolution and then taking over after the IMF loans and all that. Arcadia was an ancient region in Peloponnesus, Greece, which was founded in 370 BC, and it was completely surrounded by mountains. Its chief city was Megalopolis, which was also the center of political activity and the capital of the Arcadian Confederacy. I take a sip of the port, which is a thick, strong, and expensive. It was destroyed during the Greek Wars of Independence. I pause again. Pan was worshipped originally in Arcadia. Do you know who Pan was? Never taking her eyes off me, she nods. His revels were very similar to those of Bacchus, I tell her. He frolicked with nymphs at night, but he also liked to ... frighten travelers during the day. More ellipsis. Hence the word panic. Did you know that? And I think this is interesting because this gives us, again, an insight into who Bateman is. Some of the, even some of the book covers in the various reprints of the book have, or is that Imperial Bedrooms? I think that's Imperial Bedrooms, have a Pan character, right? Which is, it's a silhouette of a guy with Imperial Bedrooms across his eyes and a pan devil horns. And that is really what Bateman does himself, right? He revels at night and then he goes and does terrible things during the day or vice versa. But what he wants is his own Arcadia, or at least that's what his sort of soul pushes him towards, right? Or his emptiness is this sort of Arcadia where he can, worship himself in a reflection in blood, or have the disembodied heads and bodies of women that, or people that he's dominated worship him from below. And And then he says on page 284, 264, he says, a curtain of stars, miles of them are scattered, glowing across the sky, and their multitude humbles me, which I have a hard time tolerating. That's a great line. Right? He is so disgusted with humility. He can't stand that anything is bigger than himself. I have to return some videotapes, he says. Let's see. On page, he talks about Red Hot and Blue, the barbecue restaurant in D.C. on page 274. And it said, then he meets with Kimball. Hi, Pat Bateman. Sorry, T. Boone Pickens just walked in. Just joking. Hi, Pat Bateman. I love how he introduces himself as Pat Bateman throughout the book to people that he wants to be familiar with or sort of take the edge off, right? He shortens his name. On page 275, he says, Kimball is unaware of how truly vacant I am. There is no evidence of animate life in this office, yet he still takes notes. By the time you finish reading this sentence, a Boeing jetliner will take off or land somewhere in the world. I would like a Pilsner Urquell. Brilliant paragraph, right? All he's talking about is surface. There's no indication that there is animate life. Page 297, I want to read the part where he about Bono, because that one's pretty good. Let's see. I didn't mention the diction on page 75. I wrote, the diction itself, especially the adjectives, signify the lack of emotion, the mimicry of human emotions, psychopathy, plus form plus content equals meaning. All right, yeah, okay, so let me look at this page real quick. He says, with trembling fingers, I dial the number, busy, panicked. I put the phone on, constant redial, and for the next 5 minutes, nothing but a busy signal, faithful and ominous, repeats itself across the line. Finally, a ring, and in the seconds before there's an answer, I experience the rarest of occurrences, an adrenaline rush. Dorcia, someone answers, sex not easily identifiable, made androgynous by the wall of sound noise in the background. It sounds slightly less noisy than a packed football stadium, and it takes every ounce of courage I can muster to stay on the line and not hang up. I'm on hold for 5 minutes, my palms sweaty, sore from clenching the cordless phone so tightly, a fraction of me realizing the futility of this effort. Another part hopeful, another fraction pissed off that I didn't make the reservations earlier or get Gene to. The voice comes back on the line and says gruffly, Dorcia? Then he starts giggling, stunned, feverish, feeling empty. I contemplate the next move. The only sound, the dial tone buzzing noisily from the receiver. So, in other words, this is rare because in the book you rarely get these adjectives from himself, right? When he's describing things that he himself does or feels, or at least that he's mimicking. It's almost like a misapplication of adjectives and adverbs. Because this is like not something that you would feel like this about. It's the same with the business card scene. It's the same in a bunch of scenes where like he can't get what he wants, or it's the surface things that drive him into this absolute anxiety attack. It's not anything that would really fluster you like this. On page 86, we have one of the most like this is a. Okay, so he mentions volcanoes, and I noticed this because, like, the volcanic eruption that occurs in two parts of the book, or really just the mention of the word volcano, is really out of place. It's really out of place. You know, I noticed these things because the entire setting of the book is filled. It's so detailed with. The names of furniture and designers and architects and glass and steel and concrete and the interior walls and the deck chairs, like you mentioned, and the clothes and the belt buckles and the ring, the Rolex and the Ray-Bans, like everything is in the megalopolis, as he just mentioned, right? But when you get a volcano, it's completely out of place. Now we're in this weird outer zone, which is almost a blood meridian zone, and we know that it signifies the inner tempest of Bateman's psyche. And he mentioned Sartre, actually, and you can't help but think of being and nothingness, because that's what the book really is, right? It's this existential, perched on the promontory. You're standing on the promontory above the chasm of the abyss, right? Or you're down in it, in this sort of weird Satan visions of his murderous intent. And he says on page 86, her expression changes, and because of this, I noticed the book Sartre in her lap, and then the Columbia book bag by her side, and finally the tan-colored coffee in the cup, and my dollar bill floating in it. And though this all happens in a matter of seconds, it's played out in slow motion, and she looks at me, then at the cup, and shouts, "Hey, what's your problem?" Because he walked by this girl he thought was a homeless girl, and he put money in her coffee cup, but she was a student. And frozen, hunched over the cup, cringing, I stutter, I didn't know it was full. And shaken, I walk away hailing a taxi and heading toward Hubert's. In it, I hallucinate the buildings into mountains, into volcanoes. The streets become jungles. The sky freezes into a backdrop. And before stepping out of the cab, I have to cross my eyes in order to clear my vision. Lunch at Hubert's becomes a permanent hallucination in which I find myself dreaming while still awake. And he has it's a predatory vision. There's one part where he goes and he sees this woman and he says all he can think is one word: pray. Prey. And then that ties in with page 371, where, skipping way ahead, and this is part of the artistry of the book, because what Ellis does here, I talked about the bookends, and it's really it's like a microcosm, macrocosm. He does kind of what Whitman does with Song of Myself, right? I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you, right? The poem starts with I and ends with you, right? Just like the first stanza of Song of Myself begins with I and begins with you. But in the midst of the poem, we have multitudes. So we have a microcosm in the first stanza of that poem, and then we have the macrocosm of the multitude of the country. Just like in this book, we begin with it's not even a descent into the maelstrom or a descent into hell. It's already in hell, in the circle, and walking into the city of Dis, from which you can't return. And what that's saying to the reader, of course, is that once you step into this world of Bateman's, you can't ever leave, in the sense that you can't, just like in Clockwork Orange, right? You can't ever unwrite something. Once you've written it, it's been written. You can't unwrite it. And you also can't unread it. Once you've read it, you can't unread it. And there are a lot of aspects of this book which are particularly disturbing in that way, but also the humor, which is like the weird dialectical, dichotomy in the book, because we have these two things that are so opposite, but somehow they merge into this weird, surrealistic, absurd hell zone, where that Bateman takes delight in his murderous intent, right? In his willful, wanting of destruction of the world. And the book ends, of course, with the famous line, "This is not an exit," which is, look, Bret Easton Ellis is so good at a few things. Writing in general, but I can't help but notice. There's no need for me to be objective and dispassionate about the writing of the book, because that's the way I think about it. I'm like totally drawn into his ability to organize and to create this book, just like with Lunar Park, because what he does is especially remember in the last 20 pages of Lunar Park, if you saw that stream or if you've read the book, it leads up to this furious tour de force where we are plunged into the narrative. And it ends with, there's beautiful writing at the end of that book. And it's beautiful writing, but it's a terrible beauty. It's a terrifying beauty. And it's all leading to the last line of the book. Remember that the last part of Lunar Park, which I still find is amazing. He says, I'm going to reread it right now. He says, So if you should see my son, tell him I say hello. Be good, that I'm thinking of him, and that I know he's watching over me somewhere, and not to worry. He can always find me here, whenever he wants, right here, my arms held out and waiting in the pages, behind the covers at the end of Lunar Park. Which, to understand what that means, remember, you have to go back to the stream and read the book, but it's amazing. And it's cool because the book title is the last word, is the last two words, the last term in the book. So it's a self-reference. We start where we began, but we've made a full circle of this. We've learned something, right? We've become better in a way, and in this, it's sort of the opposite, right? Because remember, you started in a place where there is no exit, and at the end of the book, the last line is, "This is not an exit." Over the doorway, it's a portal. Right, he's in the restaurant, and there's a portal, and it's not only a portal out for Bateman from which he can't return, but it's a portal. It's a portal that we can't leave. We can't ever leave the thing that we've just read. Right, and that's ironic because we're leaving the book. We're finishing the book, so we are exiting, but we know that we can't exit in a way. On page 370 and 371. I mean, this is insane. He has a whole. What I'm going to do for the rest of this is I'm going to start to wind down by going over two specific passages. The part with Bono is really crazy because he goes to the place and he realizes that he says that everything becomes. Well, I'll find it in a second. But on page 370, he says, "All frontiers, if there had ever been any, seem suddenly detachable and have been removed. A feeling that others are creating my fate will not leave me for the rest of the day. This is not a game," I want to shout, but I can't catch my breath, though I don't think she can tell. I turn my face away. I need rest. I don't know what to say. Confused, I reach out for a moment to touch Mrs. Wolf's arms, to steady myself, but I stop it in midair. Move it to my chest instead, but I can't feel it, not even when I loosen my tie. It rests there, trembling, and I can't make it stop. I'm blushing, speechless. "I suggest you go," she says. This is when he's in the apartment and he meets this angelic figure, right, who expels him. We stand there in the hallway facing each other. "Don't make any trouble," she says again quietly. I stand there a few seconds longer before finally backing up, holding up my hands, a gesture of assurance. "Don't come back," she says. "I won't," I say. "Don't worry." The couple appears in the doorway. Mrs. Wolf watches me until I'm at the elevator door, pressing the button for the attendant. In the elevator, the smell of roses is overpowering. All frontiers have been crossed, right? Then again, we have, on page 371, the end of the 1980s. So again, it's an exit, but it's not an exit. And it starts off, "The smell of blood works its way into my dreams, which are, for the most part, terrible. An ocean liner that catches fire, witnessing volcanic eruptions in Hawaii, the violent deaths of most of the insider traders at Salomon, James Robinson doing something bad to me, finding myself back at boarding school, then at Harvard. The dead walk among the living." Hello? Did you hear what he just said about boarding school? And what just happened? Did you hear about what just happened at boarding school? Something bad to him? Later on, he says, this is where it all began. At Harvard is when he started to really feel like this. Probably when his dissociation came back to him and he realized what had happened to him. That and the Menendez brothers thing I mentioned earlier. And then he starts obsessing about the Madonna lyrics to what is it? Like a Prayer. "Life is a mystery. Everyone must stand alone," which is what he's doing, right? He says, this is great. At the bottom of page 371, he says, "When we look up at the clouds, she sees an island, a puppy dog, Alaska, a tulip. I see, but don't tell her, a Gucci money clip, an axe, a woman cut in two, a large puffy white puddle of blood that spreads across the sky, dripping over the city onto Manhattan." Then he goes into the coffee shop, and he says, Let's see. I'll have a nice decaf ole, Gene tells the waiter. I'll have a decapitated coffee also, I say absently before catching myself. I mean, decaffeinated. I glance over at Jean, worried, but she smiles emptily at me. Patrick, seriously, I'll do whatever you want. I just want to know what you want to do, she says. To live happily ever after, right? I say sarcastically. That's what I want. Now, interesting that he said it sarcastically, but he says that is what he wants. He wants to live happily ever after, right? He says, she repeats herself, haven't you ever wanted to make someone happy? I stare at her. A cold, distant wave of fright washes over me, dousing something. I clear my throat again and, trying to speak with great purposefulness, tell her, I was at Sugar Reef the other night, that Caribbean place on the Lower East Side. You know it. I close my eyes, page 374. I close my eyes. 3 words fall from my mouth. These lips. Kill all yuppies. She doesn't say anything. So he goes to this place and he sees this graffiti on the wall. That's sort of a great unofficial subtitle for this book. And that begins really his digression into speaking in ellipses. And the ellipsis itself is interesting in terms of the diction of the book and the construction of the narrative, because the ellipsis, one of the things I have to say about, one of the few things that I admire about Hemingway's writing, don't get mad at me for saying that if you love Hemingway. I do recognize why people love Hemingway. I'll say that. I just don't. But one of the things that he does effectively that I admire is his use of ellipsis. That ties in with his whole sort of purity of line, his whole, I guess if he were English, it would be stiff upper lip, which is that much of his writing, especially like The Sun Also Rises is a great example of this, is based in ellipsis. So Hemingway wins the Nobel Prize, was it 1960, I think, because of what he doesn't say, if that makes sense. It's not what he writes, it's the space in between the words. And in a way that's very poetic, because you have the text. If we think of this book, again, like I started off with, like poetry, right, where we have a line of verse, we have the surface level of the line of verse, which is like this thin line, right? It's this card. It's this thin line. And the power in poetry lies in the subtext, right? It's what's subterranean. It's what's submarine. It's like looking at the iceberg and we see the little ice cap floating on the surface of the waves, but we know that we can't get near it because the subsurface is this gigantic, jagged mass that's going to tear apart the ship, right? That's the important thing. That's the thing that we have to beware of. And that's what poetry is. It's like the subtext and the word, the meaning between the lines and in between the words themselves. And that is what Bateman fears most in his life, and that's what Ellis, the writer, really brings across in his prose, right? We have this. I mean, we could say it's almost like the inverted. If we invert it, it would be the volcanic eruption, right? It would be the blood. Everybody else sees the white puffy clouds, and he sees white puffy clouds full of a blood red skyline dripping on him over a dead city. He says on page 374, and this is really why I guess other people have this natural inclination to compare this to Cormac McCarthy and Blood Meridian because of the language right here. It's what I mentioned at the beginning. And he says, listen, Patrick, she says, listen, Patrick, we need to talk about something, she says, or at least I need to talk about something. ... That's the ellipsis, right? So it's what's not being said. And here he's going to say it for the first time. Where there was nature and earth, life and water, I saw a desert landscape that was unending, resembling some sort of crater, so devoid of reason and light and spirit that the mind could not grasp it on any sort of conscious level. And if you came close, the mind would reel backward, unable to take it in. It was a vision so clear and real and vital to me that in its purity it was almost abstract. This was what I could understand. This was how I lived my life, what I constructed my movement around, how I dealt with the tangible. This was the geography around which my reality revolved. It did not occur to me ever that people were good or that a man was capable of change or that the world could be a better place through one's taking pleasure in a feeling or a look or a gesture of receiving another person's love or kindness. Nothing was affirmative. The term generosity of spirit applied to nothing, was a cliche, was some kind of bad joke. Sex is mathematics. Individuality no longer an issue. What does intelligence signify? Define reason. Desire, meaningless. Intellect is not a cure. Justice is dead. Fear, recrimination. Innocence, sympathy, guilt, waste, failure, grief were things, emotions that no one really felt anymore. Reflection is useless. The world is useless. Evil is its only permanence. Love cannot be trusted. Surface was all that anyone found meaning in. This was civilization as I saw it, colossal and jagged. Holy shit. That is one of the most, I mean, that is a passage of terrifying, of a kind of terrifying negative beauty, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, it's sick and it's wrong, right? But remember, you can't mistake that this is Ellis, like this is the writer's own worldview. This is Bateman's worldview. This is his character's worldview, and we see how it makes sense. It doesn't make sense in the fact that it's not right, but we can see that in his psychopathy, in his negative reality, everything it's beyond meaningless to him, right? And that's what I was saying at the beginning, that everything to him deserves obliteration. He wants nothing to do with anything. He thinks that there's no meaning in anything. And it's interesting because, of course, to recognize that there's no meaning in anything means that there's meaning. He has to, if he's going to say that there's no truth, then the statement has to be true, which negates the statement, right? So in other words, that doesn't matter to Bateman. He's filled with something beyond hate and disgust, which is a kind of proud rage. I mean, really, there's nothing else I think that one can compare this to in terms of its sentiment and its meaning other than Blood Meridian. We got that especially with the craters. Remember the postscript, right? To Blood Meridian, where we see Judge Holden walking across the sort of lunar hellscape, digging craters into the earth, right, and lighting fires. And we've also covered, of course, the great prerequisite to this book, which would be Paradise Lost. And this would be Milton's Satan soliloquy, right, in the adamantine chains, strewn across the obsidian rocks of Pandemonium, looking at the shores of the waves of the abyss, but updated to 1991 and its publication, right? Or to 1987 going into the 1990s in terms of Bateman's own reality. And it's so much more disturbing to me than the blatant, almost comic passages of death that occur, right? Because they're written so absurd. I mean, they're so absurd on purpose. I'm not saying that's more disturbing. I'm saying that the meaning of it, because here he's talking about his actual meaning of this, the meaning of his his worldview, right? Let's see. What did Jet say? He said, this is one of those word salad JD tricks, BLA. My note here in the book was the passage signifies his absolute emptiness. He survives as a predator by choice and refuses to acknowledge anything else into a sort of a living death through Satanism, right? He says on page 376, 376 to 379 are really, he speaks in these ellipses, right? You should never mistake affection for passion, I warn her. It can be not good. It can get you into, well, trouble. Nothing. I'm just letting you know that appearances can be deceiving. Now, it's interesting because in the movie, remember, the way this is played is that he has Jean over to his apartment, and he kind of, behind her, he's playing this sort of shadow game, this sort of puppet game, the kind of puppet game that Bruce Willis plays in for dark comic effect in Pulp Fiction. Remember when he escapes from the little dungeon with the bring out the gimp, right? And he goes back upstairs and he finds what does he find? I forget what he finds first. Then he finds a chainsaw, and then finally he chooses the samurai sword. He goes back down. It's like the weapons get bigger or more deadly as they go on. One thing, the next thing, the next thing, and then when Bateman is in his apartment with Jean, he like looks in there. He's got like a knife, and then there's like duct tape and everything. And then he goes and and we see it. We don't see what's behind his back, and then he like puts the most ridiculous nail gun right to the back of her head, and she says something, and then he puts it down, and then he kind of has this little inner anxiety attack, and we realize that Jean has been saved because she's so she like represents some kind of purity for she loves him, right? But that doesn't occur in the book. That it's completely different. She's just telling him that she loves him and she wants to be with him. How could she ever understand that there isn't any way I could be... Okay, this is great. Tactfully, almost touching her hand, but stopping myself, I tell her, I just want to avoid any future misconceptions. A hard body walks by. I notice her. Then look back at Jean. Oh, come on, don't look that way. You have nothing to be ashamed of. I'm not, she says, trying to act casual. I just want to know if you're disappointed in me for admitting this. How could she ever understand that there isn't any way I could be disappointed since I no longer find anything worth looking forward to? There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me, only an entity, something illusory. And though I can hide my cold gaze and you can shake my hand and feel flesh gripping yours, and maybe you can even feel or sense that our lifestyles are probably comparable, I simply am not there. It is hard for me to make sense on any given level. Myself is fabricated, an aberration. I am a non-contingent human being. My personality is sketchy and unformed. My heartlessness goes deep and persistent. My conscience, my pity, my hopes disappeared a long time ago, probably at Harvard, if they ever did exist. There are no more barriers to cross. All I have in common with the uncontrollable and the insane, the vicious and the evil, all the mayhem I have caused and my utter indifference towards it, I have now surpassed. I still, though, hold on to one single bleak truth. No one is safe. Nothing is redeemed. Yet I am blameless. Each model of human behavior must be assumed to have some validity. Is evil something you are, or is it something you do? My pain is constant and sharp. I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, and I have countless times in just about every act I've committed, and coming face to face with these truths, there is no catharsis. I gain no deeper knowledge about myself. No new understanding can be extracted from my telling. There has been no reason for me to tell you any of this. This confession has meant nothing. There you go. So that actually is the end of the film. It's not the end of the book. The end of the book is that he watches President Bush's inauguration speech and then President Reagan on TV. Then he goes to the bar, right? And then it ends with they're arguing again about getting a res. I'm not going anywhere unless I get a res. And then there's a sign above the door that reads, "This is not an exit." So what that's telling us, right, is that, this confession has meant nothing. But it has meant something. It's meant something in its nothingness, because it is revelatory of the sense of absolute zero, right? The active nothingness of this man, this entity. Notice he says this entity, right? This being that I inhabit. He says every person has a, something that has to be assumed, and that's a pun, because he's saying that people will assume a meaning about other people. Again, we don't agree with this. Obviously, this is like demonic, right? But this is who this character is, and the person that the kind of monster that he stands for. But what it also says in terms of the pun, the other meaning is assuming the person, like living into the body. It's almost like Bateman, the person, leaves his body in dissociation, but the entity assumes his form. And he does that by assuming the form of all the people that other people want him to be. Which is why he never negates what they say about him, right? Or when they assume that he's another person. When they assume he's another person. He takes their assumption and assumes into the body, right? He inhabits this world of like there's one part where he talks about ghosts, and he talks about he feels like everyone is a ghost going in and out of his life. Oftentimes in his conversations with other people, he will mention things like, remember in the film, Did You Know I'm Utterly Insane? Right? Or he says, he'll be talking to McDermott and Bryce and Van Patten, and they'll be arguing about like, the best kind of, horse bit buckles on their new crocodile loafers. And he'll say something like, did you know my life is a living hell? And they either ignore him or they don't hear him, or they say, come on, Bateman. Fuck's sake, can't you get us a res? He's also always paying for people, and he's, they're like leeches. It's like they're leeches in the upper strata of their world. They're all leeching off all the people underneath them. They're parasites. And he realizes that, but he plays into it. He wants to be the most parasitical. He is the predator. But I think the thing that the book accomplishes in terms of its humor is that it makes it more accessible. We can understand this character, right? It's not that he's more human, it's that he's less human. He's less human, but we understand. They often talk about how, we need to, like in terms of history or historical study, they need to humanize the dictators and the monsters because they were human beings, right? Well, clever thing that this book does is that it dehumanizes everything, but in a way, the absurdity of it is what makes us understand the character on a deeper level. So that's about it, you guys. That's my analysis of American Psycho, the masterwork by Bret Easton Ellis, who, again, wrote this when he was 27 years old. I mean, that's, I'm constantly amazed by this kind of writing. Another thing that is sort of a prerequisite to this would be Don DeLeo and White Noise, because especially there's a scene where there's a passage in the book where Bateman is talking about what he's going through all the surface things that he thinks about. Rolexes, Yves Saint Laurent, right? Karl Lagerfeld. By the way, there's a great book on fashion. I know that, this is a pretty niche thing. But I just happen to, I'm interested in all reading about the landscape of literature. And there's a great book that I would recommend about that, if you want to have any understanding of like the fashion industry and its greater implications. And it's called The Beautiful Fall. And it's about the sort of power struggle between Karl Lagerfeld and Yves Saint Laurent. I just read it, and it was I picked it up. I forget where I found a mention of this, but I read all kinds of a pretty disparate source material of stuff sometimes. I read anything. And so I picked it up like 10 years ago and read it, and it was pretty revelatory. And it gives you a good insight into into a lot of this world and the world in which Bateman, of course, inhabits. I would recommend the movie. I mean, watch the movie if you haven't seen the movie. You got to see the movie. This is one of the how can you understand memes without seeing American Psycho? Right? I'm sure there are ways, but it's like one of the this is it. Also, the fact that the movie came out in 2000, pre-Big Nine, right? And it takes on the movie was not a success when it came out. And one thing about the movie is that I remember reading about the production of the movie in the newspaper as a teenager, like before I went to school. I would read I'd read the newspaper before I went to school. I'd read the front section and then the funnies and I'd do the jumble. I love the jumble, by the way. I love being able to solve the jumble without having to do any of the words. You just figure out the answer to the jumble. I like jumbles more than crosswords. And then I would read the flair section, right? Metro, read about all the murders and the murder cap, and then read the flair section. And they would always have these blurbs about how Leonardo DiCaprio was meant to star in American Psycho, in Bret Easton Ellis' American Psycho. I didn't know what American Psycho was at the time because I was a teenager. I hadn't read Less Than Zero yet. But then of course Christian Bale took the role, and this is his breakthrough role. Obviously, I remember seeing him in Empire of the Sun in 1987, and he was in Velvet Goldmine. I didn't see that till afterwards, though. That's kind of a David Bowie-esque Mark Bolan movie. But this is his breakthrough role. This got him to be who he is now, and it's his best role, obviously. And it's so funny. I mean, he really is phenomenal in the movie. The movie's phenomenal because it's so tight. It's so well written. Remember, the first scene in the movie is the drizzle, like the drizzle going across the plates at the restaurant, but it's meant to mimic blood splashes. And I found that really amusing because I remember in the late 80s and early 90s when there was this fad with restaurants where it became the opposite of it became less is more. So like I remember people satirizing the fact that like in New York you would go and pay $200 for a steak, but it would be like a Kobe steak, but it would be like this big, right? With with the drizzle. And it was like, this is the most exclusive restaurant. The charcoal arugula, right? The mud soup. And yeah, the casting is amazing. The writing is amazing. The delivery, the burning the midnight oil, Mr. Smith, right? The looks on his face. I mean, it's really a fantastic movie. I love the interviews also. But I hate watching behind the scenes stuff. It's so, it annoys me. But I remember when I first saw the DVD when DVDs first came out. Oh man, I'm old. When the DVDs first came out, and I think American Psycho was the first one I ever got in Belfast after I got the videotape. And they had one of the extras was a feature on the making of American Psycho. And I usually hate watching that kind of thing, but I watched it at the time. And it's interesting that Bale/Bateman does. I mean, when he's Bruce Wayne, he is essentially like another form of Patrick Bateman, right? And he does all the interviews in an American accent. He's Welsh, and I found that interesting. Of course, and also Bret Easton Ellis. There's a story about Bret Easton Ellis was in Toronto and just happened to walk. Like they saw a movie being filmed and they walked up to watch what it was, and it was his movie. Which is interesting. Who knows if that's true, but I think that's pretty interesting. Bret Easton Ellis has a new book coming out called The Shards, which is coming out in January, I think. Cormac McCarthy also has a trilogy coming out at the end of this month. I think October 23rd. So I'm definitely going to be getting that. The Passenger. I forget the other two. I tried to get it early, but I couldn't. So I'll be covering those three, after they come out and after I've read them. Yeah, the Midnight Oil line is funny because of the band Midnight Oil also, right? I remember that because my friend's dad had the tape Midnight Oil, and I was like, why does he have this? And we took it out of the tape machine and put it in the police. Salami, salami. But the police drummer, who's Stuart Copeland, whose dad was wrote the what did he write? Grand Chessboard, Game of Nations. He was Miles Copeland, right? CIA guy. That's how the police was able to tour in some of the places that they were. And yeah, so yeah, that's about all I got. Let's check those super chats, you guys. First of all, I want to give a special shout out to a little fat PayPal that I got early this morning as a surprise. That was really cool. Really appreciated that. And that was Mr. Peter. Mr. Peter, thank you so much, Mr. Peter out there. Thank you for that $20 fat PayPal. I really appreciate that, homeboy. Thank you so much. Shouts out to our homeboy Jason out there. Long time. We've been here for less than a year, but we've done a lot. Long time in my view. Long time and important. Significant, right? Long time in emotional supportive years. To our homeboy Jason out there who sent $10 via PayPal. Thank you so much, homeboy. Really appreciate you guys. That I've said before how much that really helps me, but you know that it helps me. You know that it helps the channel. You give anybody, you donate anything to anybody, you know it helps. How awesome is it to get paid? We get paid, right? So the fact that you guys are taking your time and your hard-earned Dugan bucks to send to your boy over here, I really appreciate that. Of course, I can't say how much I appreciate that. I'm so grateful to you. Shouts out to our homegirl Kristen out there who sends me $5 via Cash Appski. Thank you so much, Kristen. Really support you I really appreciate your support as always. Slowboy Whiteboard at YouTube. Thank you so much. Let's check the super chats on the tubes here. Let's see. What do we got here? I hope everybody has a good week. We're all the way into fall here now, Spooktober. Speaking of Spooktober, please go back and watch that stream I did with our homeboy Kotel, Church of the Eternal Logos, right? Last time, which was on Hocus Pocus 2. And also, shouts out to JD and Jamie, and thank you for the shouts out that you guys gave us on your Hocus Pocus 2 stream analysis. That was really awesome. Thank you so much for all the support. Really appreciate that. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Super chats for American Psycho. Shouts out again to my sister. Love you, sis. She super chats $5. Look at that look at that subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. Right? Sea urchin ceviche. Great. Shouts out to our homegirl Penny. Based Penny, who super chatted $2. No message. Thank you so much. Love you so much. Shouts out to our homeboy Nico out there. Congratulations on the 1K. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much, Nico, for taking the time and sending me that $5. Really appreciate you. Shouts out to our homeboy Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, the Dominator, sends $10. No message. Super chat. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Shouts out to Pim, who sends $10 for being sexy. I don't know about that, but but thank you so much. Well, shucks, you're gonna make me blush. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for that $10 for being sexy. Shouts out to Genghis again for that $1.99 super chat. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Thanks to our Aussie homeboy out there, DJ Day Gyre, who sends $7.99 Aussie dollars. That was a Northern Irish accent. I don't know why I did that. That was weird. Sorry. How do you say it in Australian? Dollars. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Who sent $7.99 Oz bucks and says, "Thanks, dude. Listen, man, you are welcome, dude. It's my pleasure, and thank you so much. Really, thank you for supporting me so much. Let's see. We got. Let's see. We got another super chat here from Pim. BLA, have you seen Existenz? Yes, I've seen Existenz. It was a long time ago. Who's in Existenz? Jude Law? Is Jude Law in Existenz? I can't remember. Hold on, let me check. Let me make sure it's Jude Law. Yes, it is. Yeah, Jude Law and Jennifer Jason Leigh. By the way, I love Jennifer Jason Leigh. She's awesome. She was really good in Hateful Eight. I'm really, I love Tenton Quarantino. But I got to say that The Hateful Eight is my least favorite of his movies, and that's because I thought it was, I thought it was gratuitous in a way that was not that I didn't like. Unlike the other movies, I didn't think that the gratuitous nature of the movie was. Obviously, Pulp Fiction is gratuitous, right? But it's different. And I thought that I was just really. But the one scene that I really didn't like in that was where it involved Jennifer Jason Leigh and something. I just didn't like it. I didn't like it at the beginning. I thought it was too much. But yeah, you didn't ask about that. You asked about Existence. Oh, a great movie with Jennifer Jason Leigh though is she in High Art? There's a movie called High Art. That movie actually has the guy who plays Van Patten in American Psycho, and it's about the art world in New York, which is it's kind of an underground movie, I guess, art movie. Was Jennifer Jason Leigh in that? I can't remember. Sorry, I'm babbling now. Now I'm losing track of my own mind because I can't remember. No, that was Ali Sheedy. Sorry, I mixed the two up. No, but I love Jennifer Jason Leigh. Ali Sheedy's cool too. No, Existence. Wow, what you got to say about Existence, Pim? Should I go back and check it out? All I remember is. Oh yes, no, I did. I watched it. It's Cronenberg, isn't it? Yeah, it's Cronenberg. I watched it last year. Yeah, Jeff and I were talking about Existence because it's about body mods, right? Body mods and gamers, and I remember watching it. I tend to avoid movies with like body horror like that, which is interesting because I did just watch the new Hellraiser. Have you guys seen the new Hellraiser? Oh boy, I would not recommend it. Okay. It is the most. I think it's probably the most satanic movie I've ever watched. And the body horror in it. I was sitting there choking on my Hardee's, y'all. I was trying to sit there eat some chicken strips and some fries, and I almost choked on it. I thought it was so gnarly. But yeah, obviously well, it is what it is. Don't quit your day job. Pim says, yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. Naked Lunch Director. Yeah. Naked Lunch. I think I've seen all Cronenberg. And I especially like, actually, it's funny how Cronenberg like went through this kind of weird shift, right? Went through sort of a renaissance and did Eastern Promises and History of Violence. And those are totally different types of Cronenberg movies, but I love those. Existence was good because of the body mods aspect of it, right? But it's also kind of gross. So movies like that I kind of avoid a little bit. But I do like this. This is ironic that I do like Brandon Cronenberg. I don't know if I like it, but I thought that Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor was terrifying. Terrifying in a way that like I understood because it deals with all the stuff that we talk about. I mean, it's got DID and he's an assassin, and it's set. It's a sort of a dystopian. Elites and the future and all this stuff, and so I thought that one was really really well done. But yeah, I'll take a look. I'll go back and look at Existence. So thank you for that, Pim. I really appreciate that. And Jude Law, I like Jude Law. I think I started to tell you a story one time about Jude Law when he was hanging out at my best friend's house. They were having a party, and he was there because he was filming Cold Mountain. And I couldn't really finish the story, but Jude Law is pretty as an actor. I thought I've kind of liked Jude Law. Jude Law was best friends with Johnny Lee Miller when they were younger, and Sadie Frost like when they were first starting out. And I really like Johnny Lee Miller because he's Sick Boy, right, in Trainspotting, and I like him as Holmes. I think he's a good Sherlock Holmes. He played Byron in a film. Remember Johnny Lee Miller was married to Angelina Jolie first. They were in Hackers first, right? I think one of Jude Law's best roles is Cold Mountain. I mean, I think it was hard to film the Charles Frazier novel, but I like it because it was filmed in Virginia, close to me. It was filmed right there on the James River, and it was also filmed in Charleston. So I like that. I thought that was cool. Okay, so I think that's about all I got, you guys. Really appreciate y'all. And I thank you so much. And we'll be back again maybe tomorrow night. I'm planning right now on tomorrow night unless things come up IRL. But we're going to be doing our Caddyshack stream, and that will be totally different, right? Because all of our streams here, all of our analyses are we base everything in literature. That's the whole point. Caddyshack, on the other hand, has really no basis in literature at all. But we're going to do that because it'll be fun. It'll be fun, and it'll be a good 1K celebration stream. So if you're watching this, please, and you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, leave me a comment afterwards. I really appreciate all the comments. They help me with the algorithm. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for being here. Thanks to all my mods and my homies out there. Thanks to all the people in our big circle. Thanks to all of our friends. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week, a wonderful rest of Spooktober, trademark JD. And that's about all I got, y'all. I love y'all. Keep on living. That's all I got.